It's now my pleasure to recognize the second panel of witnesses. Dr. Andrew Biggs is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute for Policy Research. Mr. Mark Mix is the President of the National Right to Work Committee. Dr. Robert Novi Marks is a Professor of Finance at the University of Rochester Simon Graduate School of Business. And let's see if I may get this right. Dr. Desmond Lockman is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Pursuant to the House rules, all witnesses will be sworn in. Would you please rise to take the oath? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record indicate all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. We will suspend opening remarks. I simply want to thank you for your patience. I know that we had an audience that included your presence, and your testimony is every bit as important because ultimately the facts will determine a great deal of what the committee does going forward. With that, Dr. Biggs. Oh, I'm sorry. Yep, with that, Dr. Biggs.
Thank you very much. Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify with regard to the financial and budgetary challenges facing State governments. I will touch on three topics related to State government finances: public sector pensions, public employee compensation, and State investment practices. Financing for public employee pensions poses significant challenges, but as bad as the current pension funding situation may appear, the reality is likely far worse. The GAO reports that funding for public sector pensions currently equals around 12% of public sector wages. But these figures are based on current accounting rules which allow plans to discount guaranteed benefit liabilities using the expected interest rate on a portfolio of risky assets. Economists are nearly unanimous in believing this approach to be both technically wrong, as it understates the true value of plan liabilities, and from a policy perspective dangerous, as it encourages State and local pensions to take excessive investment risk. If public sector pensions were required to use economically sound accounting rules, the cost of pension funding would rise from around 12% of employee wages to an astronomical 46%. This latter figure represents the true value of the pension benefits being promised and the true burden being placed on the public. The difference between the 12% and 46% figures represents the value of the risk that State pension funds are taking. States reduce the apparent pension cost burden by investing in risky assets, but this merely increases the contingent liabilities borne by taxpayers should investment returns falter. Whether States resolve rising employee health and pension costs by increased taxes or reduced benefits depends in part upon how they judge the overall compensation of public sector employees. A number of recent studies have concluded that public employees in Wisconsin and other States are significantly underpaid relative to what similar individuals would receive in the private sector. These studies have been cited in arguing against changes to public sector compensation. But existing analyses of State and local pay significantly undercount future pension benefits, omit entirely retiree health coverage, and ignore the value of higher public sector job security. Correcting for these errors generates very different conclusions. In certain large States, such as California, average public employee compensation is around 30% above what similar private sector workers would receive. In Wisconsin, we found a public sector pay premium of around 10%. While compensation varies from State to State, the broad view that State and local employees are significantly underpaid is almost certainly false. Finally, I wish to touch on the investment practices of State and local pensions. Public pension accounting literally says that a plan that takes more investment risk immediately becomes better funded, to the tune of tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars. For policymakers seeking to avoid difficult choices, riskier investment portfolios are an attractive alternative. Since the mid-1980s, the typical public sector pension portfolio has nearly doubled the share of equities that it holds. Today, the shift is towards so-called alternative investments, which include private equity, hedge funds, and the like. In forthcoming research, I calculate that public sector pensions have actually increased the risk of their target portfolio allocations since the financial crisis of 2007. There is the danger that rather than learning from experience, pensions will seek to double down in an effort to avoid the inevitable. A number of states have also issued billions of dollars of pension obligation bonds, meaning in effect that they are making risky investments with borrowed money. But increased risk in pension investments makes state and local finances as a whole more subject to the shifting winds of financial markets. Moreover, it is not clear that lawmakers fully understand the investments they are making. The solution to this problem is better pension accounting that removes the dangerous incentives towards ever-increasing levels of investment risk. Better information is the key to better policy. Lawmakers around the country can turn state and municipal finances around, just as lawmakers here in Washington can turn around federal finances. But time is a luxury that is growing short. While still mired in a recession, it is difficult to contemplate painful long-term reforms. But there is reason to believe that such reforms, if properly enacted, can generate new confidence among citizens, businesses, and financial markets that American government at all levels has the capacity to get on top of its budgetary problems. And during an economic slowdown, renewed confidence is essential to a recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Mix?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to participate. May we live in interesting times. That was an old, allegedly an old Chinese blessing, or more accurately, a curse that seems to be a pronouncement appropriate for the topic of today's hearing. Clearly, there are tough choices ahead as states and municipalities deal with the clear and present danger of fiscal crisis. There is growing evidence that the fiscal house of many states and municipalities are in desperate states. Several questions arise as a takeoff point for this discussion, but an obvious one is what municipalities and states must do to fix it. But that question can't be answered until we understand the cause of the condition. This is where I will comment. I believe that the primary cause of the current condition is the inability to implement reform as a result of actions taken decades ago that empowered government union officials with privileges that are inappropriate for the functions of government. Specifically, I am talking about the granting private sector labor organizations the privilege of monopoly bargaining over government workers. Let's be clear here. This does not mean that government workers don't have the right to join a union and they can't associate. It means about a recognition. That right shouldn't be taken away for the right to join and associate. But it does mean that the model that we ascribe to the private sector is completely inappropriate for government. And that's now becoming clear. And I'm in good company with that premise, as we've heard already the testimony of members of Congress citing President Roosevelt's opposition to government bargaining. But he also agrees with George Meany, the new president of the AFL-CIO in 1955, who said it's impossible to bargain collectively with the government. At the February 59 meeting of the AFL-CIO Executive Council, a statement prepared by representatives of the Government Employee Council was endorsed, which included the following. It said, in terms of accepted collective bargaining procedures, government workers have no right beyond the authority to petition Congress, a right available to every citizen. In New York State, the petri dish of government union power, New York City, Democrat Mayor Robert Wagner was advised to break a campaign pledge made to government union officials because granting union monopoly bargaining would grant too much power to union officials and whet their appetites for even more. His advisors told him it would give unions too much sway over elected officials. And Wagner's advisors were right. After the New York City model had been in place for several years, former New York AFSCME union president Victor Gottbaum boasted, "We have the ability to elect our own boss." A New York State court spelled it out more precisely in the years earlier in a case called Railway Mail Associates versus Murphy, in which they opined to tolerate or recognize any combination of civil service employees of the government as a labor organization or union is not only incompatible with the spirit of democracy, but inconsistent with every principle upon which our government is founded. To admit as true that government employees have the power to halt the functions of government unless their demands are satisfied is to transfer to them all legislative, executive, and judicial power. Nothing could be more ridiculous. Fast forward to today, we see dramatic impact of the process which is inconsistent with every principle upon which our government is founded. In the May 2010 Business Insider website published a list of the 9 states most likely to default. The news and analysis-oriented site ranked heavily unionized California, Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, and Wisconsin as the worst default risks. An average of 61% of public sector employees in that 9 states with the worst default risk are under union monopoly bargaining power in 2009. That's overall public unionization of 20% higher than the typical state. In the 9 states with the worst default risk from 1999 to 2009, aggregate private sector jobs fell 4.2%, but state and local government jobs increased by 9%. Not one of the 22 states with the 2009 public sector unionization rate of under 30% was found to be on the Business Insider's most likely to default list. Further, Washington Examiner editor Dave Freddoso recently analyzed the relationship between public sector unionization and state per capita debt. Freddoso found that among the states with fewer than 40% of state and local government workers are unionized, the median per capita state debt in 2007 was $2,238. Among the states between 40 and 60, the median debt was $3,609. But among the states with more than 60% of the state and local government workers unionized with monopoly bargaining laws, the median per capita debt was $6,380. And these are 2007 numbers before we even got to the economic crisis. Excessive spending, taxation, and debt are endemic to governments everywhere. But there are large measurable differences between the states that have handed monopoly privileges to public sector union officials and states that have resisted the pressure. In any discussion of state and municipal debt and the tough choices ahead, they must include the issues of growing government union monopoly power and the impact on the states, municipalities, and most important, taxpayers.
Thank you. Professor Novi-Marx.
Contrary to several of the statements made here this morning, state and local pension systems are significantly underfunded. The shortfalls faced by these systems represent massive debts that public employees and retirees expect state and local taxpayers to repay. The amounts that are owed are large enough to threaten the continuing viability of many state and local government systems and pose considerable risk for federal taxpayers. The exact magnitude of the problem has been concealed by the flawed accounting methodology prescribed by the Government Accounting Standards Board, or GASB. I can illustrate these flaws with a simple example. If I take $1 out of my right pocket and put it into my left pocket, I presume that you will all agree that doing so has made me neither richer nor poorer. The idea that moving money from one pocket to another could somehow make you richer insults common sense. Yet this is the idea upon which the state's current claims that pension funds are only $1 trillion underfunded is based. Under GASB rules, a plan's reported financial status improves when it takes on more investment risk. When a plan moves $1 from its right pocket bonds into its left pocket stocks, it magically gets richer, less underfunded. This logic is clearly flawed. $1 of stocks is not worth more than $1 of bonds. When you as an individual move money from your money market fund into the stock market, you're not suddenly richer. You do not get to pretend that you owe less on your home mortgage. The payments that you're obligated to make on your house are completely unchanged. How you invest your assets has no impact on the current value of your liabilities. This is just as true for the states as it is for individuals, despite GASB's claims to the contrary. Properly accounted for, the unfunded portion of pension promises already made to state and local workers is roughly $3 trillion, or 3 times as large as that recognized under GASB. This exceeds all recognized state and local debt combined and represents a debt owed to state and local government workers of roughly $25,000 for each U.S. household. These large unfunded liabilities are a serious concern, but perhaps even more troubling is how the current methodology accounts for new benefit accruals, that is, how governments value the retirement benefits as a part of workers' total annual compensation. Under current accounting, the annual recognized cost of newly earned pension benefits averages roughly 12 to 15% of total wages, with plan members contributing on average slightly less than half that amount. The true cost of new service accruals is roughly twice as large, 25 to 30% of total wages, meaning that each year most state and local workers earn employer-financed pension benefits worth more than 20% of their salaries. This is not to say that public employees are overcompensated. I personally value the services provided by government workers, and am certain that many public sector workers are underpaid. This does not, however, provide an excuse for misvaluing the benefits they receive. Undervaluing the deferred compensation these pension benefits represent has serious negative consequences for the way governments operated. It encourages excessive growth in the public sector. It also encourages states to finance current operations with off-balance sheet debt, leaving even larger bills for future taxpayers. In negotiations between states and their workers, undervalued retirement benefits give both sides at the bargaining table incentives to trade current wages for future pension benefits. Workers will happily give up $1 today for $2 worth of benefits that the government accounting methodology values at less than $1. Current administrations may happily agree to this arrangement if it frees up money in current budgets. As a result, state, city, and county pension plans have become a pervasive tool for circumventing balanced budget requirements. Because the current contributions fall short of the cost of new benefit accruals, the state and local pension problem is getting worse, not better, and this represents a concern for the federal government. If the federal government cannot credibly commit to allowing states to fail, then the states have little incentive to fix their problems. In the event of a federal bailout, taxpayers in fiscally more responsible states will subsidize those in more profligate states. So any state that undertakes the unpalatable combination of tax increases and service cuts required to address its pension problems now risks losing its share of any federal funds used in the future to rescue the system. The federal government consequently has an urgent need to establish incentives for states to deal with their pension problems. The Public Employee Pension Transparency Act, H.R. 567, is a useful first step. Congress should consider even stronger measures, however, to ensure that federal taxpayers are not the ultimate underwriter of state debts. These should include incentives for states to close current plans to new workers and to instead enroll new hires in transparent defined contribution plans and Social Security. They should also encourage states to fully recognize the true magnitude of their legacy pension liabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lockman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to testify before this committee. The European sovereign debt crisis offers a cautionary tale to the United States about the very high costs that could be associated with continuous delays in fashioning a credible medium-term plan to address its budget problems. In 1999, when the euro was first launched, the European Stability and Growth Pact required that member countries contain their budget deficits to no more than 3% of GDP and that they maintain their public debt levels at below 60% of GDP. Despite those strictures, by 2009, Greece and Ireland registered budget deficits around 15% of GDP, while Portugal and Spain registered budget deficits in the region of 10% of GDP. It is now expected that Greece and Ireland's public debt to GDP will reach over 160% and 120% respectively by 2012, even under optimistic assumptions. A notable feature of the European debt crisis is that until very recently, markets failed to discipline profligate governments in the European periphery, and those governments were able to borrow at interest rates only marginally higher than those required of the German government. Markets also provided the financing that made possible massive housing market bubbles in Ireland and Spain, and they failed to exercise their desired disciplinary function in the mistaken belief that this time was different and that Eurozone membership would automatically make countries in the European periphery converge to the strong economic performance of the German economy. The important lesson for the United States is that when markets did finally turn on the European periphery, they did so in an abrupt and dramatic fashion. Greek and Irish governments were effectively shut out of the capital markets. They were forced to seek bailout packages from the IMF and the EU. And more recently, last week, the caretaker Portuguese government was also forced to seek an EU bailout as external funding for the Portuguese government totally dried up. Despite these massive bailout packages, markets are still demanding very high interest rates now of these countries. And these high interest rates imply that the market is attaching a very high probability to the likelihood that these countries will actually default on their sovereign debt within the next 3 to 5 years. As a condition for their bailout lending, the IMF and EU are requiring of Greece and Ireland massive budget adjustment of the order of 10% of GDP over the next 3 years. Countries in the European periphery are now finding that attempting to dramatically tighten their budgets without being in the position to weaken their currencies to boost export growth is a recipe for steep economic recession in these countries. Sadly, Greece and Ireland are already finding this out. Over the past 2 years, GDP has declined in Greece and Ireland by 8% and 12% respectively, and the unemployment rates have both climbed beyond 14%. To sum up, Europe's recent difficult experiences with its public finances would seem to offer the United States the following 4 cautionary lessons. First, U.S. policymakers should not take comfort from the fact that despite its very poor public finances, the U.S. government can still finance itself at very low interest rates. Up till early 2010, the Greek, Irish, Portuguese governments all were able to fund themselves at relatively low interest rates, only to find themselves subsequently virtually shut out of the capital market. The second point is that when markets finally do lose confidence in the sustainability of a government's public finances, they tend to do so in an abrupt and disruptive manner. This tends to be highly disruptive to financial markets, and it tends to be associated with prolonged and deep economic recessions. One also finds that once a government loses the market's confidence, it proves difficult to regain the market's trust. Thirdly, dependence on foreign sources of financing exposes a government to the vicissitudes of foreign credit markets. It also places a government in a position where foreigners can dictate the terms of future lending that can be harmful to a country's economic prospects. Finally, disruption in a government's bond market can have important implications for the financial system, which tends to be a primary holder of government bonds. Experience shows that a weakened financial system is generally associated with lower long-term growth. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll yield myself 5 minutes at this time. Professor Novi-Marx, in some of your published studies, you seem to take issue with Vermont's governor's theory that he's first fully funded and then adequately funded. If we make reasonable assumptions that today, for some reason, they chose to go to a defined contribution, how much underfunding would there be in the legacy of Vermont's system?
So I don't know if you're talking about a soft freeze or a hard freeze. Are we talking about moving all workers onto DC plans or just new hires?
Well, if you assume that it's all workers, that whatever they've accrued, they keep, and obviously there's some middle ground of those who are 3 or 4 or 5 years, but assuming you phased it out very quickly,
it would improve the position of their financial status of their pension plans.
It would improve that, but what would be the shortfall in their pension? In other words, if they achieve the 8.5% starting the day that you shut it off, they would be able to make all of their payments forever. Is that correct?
They would have a small shortfall, but not a huge shortfall if they made 8% on their assets. Yeah.
What is the reasonable belief that 8.5% can be made, particularly considering that they have credit default swaps?
It is less than 50% that they would make that sort of return. Essentially, they've borrowed a lot of money to speculate in the stock market, and if the stock market does better than the cost of their borrowing, they will be in a better position. If it does worse, they will be in a much worse position. But I view this idea that you can achieve 8.5% by investing in the stock market as essentially borrowing public money to speculate in the stock market.
And if we assume for a moment that there's some discount for inflation in the 8.5%, let's call it 2.5%, they're really saying they want to earn 6% over inflation. Would that be correct? Roughly.
So
they're looking at making
in the terms of their own plans, they assume inflation rates that are higher than the market or consensus estimates.
If we were to use a baseline, and this may delve into others, we were to use a baseline, let's say, of from any given time till 1980. In other words, not the last 30 years. Is there any ability to achieve broadly 6% over inflation in America's 20th century? Is there any 20-year period in which you can earn that kind of money?
The 2 decades after World War II, the U.S. stock market did very well, and your returns would have exceeded that.
Are there any 20 years in which you can't?
There certainly are, yes.
So what we're really doing is we're saying we think we're going to make it, but if we don't, and this is why I want to get to the next point, if we don't make it, then what happens? And let me just, and I'm a Californian, so I live this every day. During good times, good economic times, times in which the market is performing, and so is America, the need for the social safety network generally goes down. So the government spending, state government spending, Medicaid and so on, typically goes down. If that's the case, then when you have lower spending, you have higher earnings within those 10 or 20 years. Turn it around. When the market goes to heck in a handbasket, typically you have people laid off and greater public need. Is that sort of universally agreed to by all the panel? So no matter what we're dealing with, we're assuming that the present system is one in which you must pay in more over a 3-5 year period. All of these plans have a certain waiting period. Typically, they're trailing 3 years or something. Some of them go 5. But in any really long, bad time of 10 years, for example, you're going to have to pay in more at a time in which you're paying out more. Is that generally true?
That is true.
So for any of you on the panel, even forgetting about ideological reasons that we may want to choose other systems, the governor of Vermont said this was more efficient. Let's assume efficiency is as he defines. Is it better for the reliability to the taxpayer, the people who will count on services in bad times and who, in fact, don't want to be misled in good times? Is there any basis to say that that system of needing more money paid into pensions at a time when there's less to pay and more needed, and then needing less so you look good exactly at a time when it's only because people need less from the government?
I think you've put your finger on the fundamental sort of error in the governor's reasoning. The bad times for the pension, the bad rates of return on its investments will correlate with bad times in the rest of the economy, which means more people out of work, lower tax revenues, higher expenditures for unemployment benefits, things like that. So you're asking taxpayers or contributors to the plan to pay extra into the plan to make up for losses at exactly the time they're least able to do that. So that's the problem. And when you get this correlation between the poor market outcomes and poor outcomes in other parts of the economy, it makes it more painful to do those things. A market valuation approach to looking at pension financing implicitly takes that into account, whereas the current GASB rules ignore that fact.
Anyone else have a brief? Yes, Doctor.
I just add to the point that you're making that we don't live in ordinary times, that we're living in a period where we've had an asset price bust, where we've had real strains in the banking system. There's plenty of economic research that shows that those periods are followed by unusually low growth, where you'd expect to get very poor returns on equities. All you've got to do is look at the Japanese experience right now. 1989, well, 1989, the Nikkei was at 39,000. Today, 20 years later, it's at 10,000. So we're living in a different time. To expect to get an 8% return after an economic crisis like this would seem to me to be heroic.
Thank you. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, you all heard the testimony of the two governors, did you not? And you heard Governor Walker numerous times saying that he liked what Mitch Daniels did in Indiana. Did you all hear that? And sounds like he may be his mentor. But let me ask about the legislation recently introduced in Indiana. This legislation would make it a misdemeanor for an employer to require an individual to become or remain a member of a labor organization, pay dues, fees, or other charges to a labor organization, or pay charity to another third party that represents dues, fees, or other charges required of members of a labor organization. Governor Mitch Daniels originally favored this legislation and prior bills that opposed unions. In 2005, he signed an executive order limiting collective bargaining for state workers. As a result, according to an April 13th National Review article, the number of state union workers shrunk from over 16,000 in 2005 to now nearly 1,500. Mr. Mix, your organization supports Indiana's legislation, is that right? I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Sorry. We oppose the statutory imposing of bargaining rights in Indiana going back to the middle 1990s. It was imposed by executive order by Governor Evan Bayh, and then there was an executive order signed by Governor Frank O'Bannon to force Indiana employees to pay dues or fees to the union to keep their job. What Governor Daniels did was simply repeal that executive order that authorized bargaining in the state.
So therefore,
never a statute there.
So you
we would support what Governor Daniels did, yes.
You support what he did. And despite your organization's support, Governor Daniels has now withdrawn support from this legislation. Have you heard that?
He has indicated that he opposes consideration of a right-to-work bill, which was the reason that 39 Democrats left the state for 33 days and shut down the Indiana legislature. He opposes that right-to-work bill that's pending in the Indiana House right now.
And a February 22nd article featured in Politico indicated that the governor thought there was a better time and place to have the debate. Is that right?
I think that's right. That's accurate.
He also stated that even the smallest minority has every right, and I'm quoting him, by the way.
Yes, sir.
Every right to express the strength of its views and and I salute those who did, end of quote. Do you agree with that?
Well, if Governor Daniels is talking about the fact that 39 Democrats left the State to stop this legislation, I disagree with him.
All right.
On
I only have a limited amount of time. I heard you. You disagree with him, okay?
I disagree with him praising 39 members leaving their jobs to stop the bill. Yeah.
You disagree with him?
Yes, sir.
Your organization does not just support the concept of this legislation. You've financially pushed it, have you not? Your organization?
What legislation are you talking about?
I'm talking about the subject matter that we're talking about right now. That is,
the right to work bill is different than what Governor Daniels did. We have been involved in Indiana for a while now. Yeah.
and so you put some money in this. And according to an article on March 23rd in the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, your organization began and I quote, $100,000 statewide media campaign to try to get the issue back on the table. Does it sound accurate?
Absolutely.
And one newspaper ad tries to shame Daniels and Bosma for bending to the unions, and that's end of quote. Mr. Bosma is a Republican Speaker of the Indiana House, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Mix, did your organization place those advertisements?
We did.
And staff have identified at least 10 Republican governors, including Governor Daniels, who have distanced themselves from Governor Walker, and in particular his assault on collective bargaining rights for workers. But your organization continues to agree with the Governor Walker's actions. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think this hearing has demonstrated that Governor Walker wildly overreached by insisting on stripping the rights of American workers, even when such measures would have absolutely no impact on the State budget. And Mr. Biggs, I wanted to follow up on a point that I think is extremely important. As Governor Schublin made very clear in his testimony earlier, the budget shortfalls that are affecting States today were not caused by middle-class American workers. They were not caused by these teachers and nurses, policemen, firefighters. Schublin testified that, and this is his quote, "I would like to start by directly addressing the question of what is causing the current fiscal crisis that most of our States are experiencing. Put simply, these crises are the result of the greatest economic recession since the Depression, the Great Depression." Dr. Biggs, do you agree with that?
I think that's generally correct, yeah.
And Dr. Biggs, on March 15, 2011, you testified before this committee, and you seemed to agree with Governor Schumlin's point. In your testimony, you said this. You said the fiscal crisis at the State and local level has many causes. The proximate cause is the significant economic recession from which the United States economy still struggles to recover. Did you say that?
That's correct.
And in your testimony today, Mr. Biggs, you explained that different states may have different challenges based on how the economic crisis affected them. You stated that when looking at the financial challenges faced by states, the differences arise from how hard the states were hit by the recession. Is that right?
That's also correct, yes.
And so you're not alone. And as I close, in your views that these budget shortfalls are a result of recession. And let me read Ezra Klein's what he wrote in the Washington Post. He says, quote, "There was no sharp rise in collective bargaining in 2006 and 2007, no major reforms of the country's labor laws, no dramatic change in how unions organize, and yet State budgets collapse." So I say this all to all of you witnesses. If you want to talk about balancing the State budget, then let's talk about the budget. Let's talk about the real reasons for shortfall, and let's talk about the real solutions. I see my time has expired. Thank you.
I thank the ranking member. Ms. Burkle is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for being here today and for answering our questions. My first question, and this is sort of a follow-up to my colleague Mr. Cummings' question. Mr. Mix, in your written remarks, you note that there is a close correlation between high State debt and the existence of public sector monopoly bargaining. Can you explain that for me and just expound on that a little bit?
Yes, ma'am. I think the correlation between the cost of government and the proposition, the union density, is something that is becoming clear. And if you look at the numbers that I cited from the study regarding per capita median State debt, per person, I think you see that coming clearly. I think it's important also to understand that, the idea of bargaining and the ability for a private third party to engage themselves in the relationships between taxpayers and their elected officials is something we need to address. And I think if you look at the states, the 9 states that are running the risk of default, all those states had a union density over 60% in the government sector.
I represent an area of New York State, and actually, Professor Novy Marks, it's close to Rochester. So we are one of those 44 states that they were spoken of this morning, that we teeter on this delicate balance here. And so I'd like to just follow up again with my colleagues, Mr. Cummings' comment with regards to Governor Walker. Do you feel that he overreached, Mr. Mix?
I don't. I think the idea that allowing workers the choice to join or financially support a labor union is a basic right. The legislation, the part of the legislation that Governor Walker talked about and was in question here today was a provision granting Wisconsin public employees the right to work, free of union compulsion. Any member that believes the union represents them well and wants them to speak for them can voluntarily join that organization and have their voices heard, just like any other citizen can. But we should not presume that that every worker out there supports what organized labor is doing for them and that there is a benefit conferred on those people. What we ought to do is give them the choice. And what union officials ought to do is represent only those workers that want their representation, because we know that any organization that is brought together through voluntary means is inherently stronger than any organization that's compelled, is cobbled together by compulsion.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Lockman. You note in your written remarks that the United States budget deficit has swollen, as we know, to close to $1.5 trillion, about 10% of the GDP. It's on a path to reach within a year or two the levels of funding crisis that we've seen in other countries. What common sense, practical steps can we take as a nation to just avoid what we've seen from some of our countries?
Well, you're absolutely right that the United States is on a path that is clearly unsustainable and that will lead to a debt crisis going down the road. The sensible thing for the United States to do would be to have a medium-term budget program that seriously and credibly addressed those problems, that brought down the deficit progressively over time. You're seeing that, for instance, in the United Kingdom right now, where they have got a medium-term budget plan that is going to be reducing the budget deficit by something like 1.8 percentage points of GDP a year, bringing it down from something like 10 to 3 within a period of time. But they're doing it in a credible way with actual measures passed through their parliament. It would seem that that is what is needed, if you're going to be assuring markets that you're seriously dealing with the problem rather than just running up huge deficits and then have the markets fear that the Federal Reserve is going to monetize it and we're going to be off to the races on inflation.
And just in the few seconds that I have left, can you just define or expand on that credible way that you're talking about?
Well, I think that it's important to do things in a variety of ways. Is that to backload a fiscal plan isn't really credible. There are a lot of changes that might occur down the road, that what one's wanting is upfront concrete measures in where there's a clear congressional commitment that measures are going to be actually implemented. It's no good just talking about we intend to do things, that you've got to back it up by action that markets are going to believe that you're actually going to be delivering. And that having benchmarks, having a path on which you're going, having concrete measures that you're going to be taking, actually passing those measures, would give the markets a lot more confidence right now. And I think that the only point that I was really trying to get across is not to be fooled by the fact that the United States government, with its huge deficit, is able to borrow in the Treasury market at, say, 3% on 10-year bonds. That can move in a heartbeat.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our panelists. I yield back.
I thank my colleague. Dr. Biggs, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Biggs, I had this discussion before in the series of hearings we've had about the state and municipal debt crisis, that there's a choice government has to make with the revenues it gets from its people. So, when we have pension funds, a discussion about pension funds, if it's a private sector pension fund, if it's underfunded, those that should receive the pension are the ones that are getting harmed. If it's underfunded in the private sector, there's another group, sort of the forgotten man, if you will, that are the taxpayers that are either going to pay higher taxes because these pensions were underfunded, whether it's through union contracts or whatever it may be. Then you have not only taxpayers, but those people that desire a benefit out of their government. For instance, you live in a city and they lay off half the fire department or some of the police, or they don't have frequent trash service. I mean, there are services you would diminish in order to meet certain demands. Can you talk about this in terms of what that actually means, those choices?
Well, I think this plays very well into the issue of how we measure the pension liabilities. One of the arguments for the way current accounting rules for pensions is, government is different than the private sector. Government is infinitely lived. It's very big. It will go on forever. So we can ignore this risk. But when you look at how the risk is actually allocated, government is a pass-through entity. It doesn't bear the risk. It distributes it to different stakeholders. So when we look around the country today, we see individuals who are having to pay higher taxes to support pensions. We see layoffs in government workforces. We see cuts in other programs so they can make room for their pension contributions. So it's not the government that is bearing the risk of those market downturns. It's effectively individuals who are bearing it. And so that's why we should value these pension liabilities the way that individuals do it. I think the one sort of troubling aspect of the way defined benefit pensions the public sector have worked in practice is often the market risk is one-sided. In very good economic times, part of the money goes to help fund the pension, but there's also the temptation to raise benefits. We saw this in California. We've seen it in New Jersey. We've seen it in Washington State. But in the down times, it's the taxpayer who takes that risk. So anytime you have one-sided bets, you're setting yourself up for some problems. But the key issue is really it's not government that is bearing the risk. It's people in all aspects of our lives. And so we want to catch that issue there in terms of how we value these liabilities.
Can you also discuss in terms of asset sales, whether at the state or at municipal level, that you have an asset that local governments have sold in order to meet immediate expenses, as these asset sales as a form of indirect bankruptcy, if you will?
In a sense, I guess selling off an asset is like borrowing, because the asset, in theory, would give you value down the road. But if you're selling it off, you're saying we're going to get some cash today, but we're giving up all that stream of payments that we otherwise could have had it. But I think the point you make is correct. If you're having to sell off assets that you'd otherwise want to keep in order to make payments, it is a form of partial bankruptcy. It's in effect eating your seed corn, because those are assets you're going to need down the road.
Okay. You mentioned that the importance of getting the accounting right, and Dr. Nova-Marks, you did as well, and you're more specific. But Dr. Biggs, can you talk about this in terms of accounting? And,
the funny thing is, my father was a certified public accountant, and I remember growing up thinking, oh, these accounting things are so boring, and why would you want to do that? What I've discovered working in public policy is what you do about a problem really depends on how you measure the problem. The way we currently measure public pension financing, we learn two things from that. The current measures tell us the problem is small and can be solved by taking more investment risk. Using proper accounting measures, we realize the opposite. The problem is large, and taking more investment risk isn't going to solve it. Right. So talking about accounting sounds boring, but I think if you really measure things correctly, you get an idea of how big your problem is and what will and what won't fix it.
Dr. Nova-Marks.
Thank you. I'm not an expert on unions and don't have a lot to say about them per se,
No, that's fine.
but I think there is a real danger in bargaining over things which are improperly valued. So I think that the valuation of the pension liabilities very much interacts with the bargaining, because if we way undervalue these benefits, it makes it extremely hard for the government side to argue, to bargain from a fair position.
Excellent. So, Dr. Biggs, in terms of this, there's the GASB versus FASB. You've got the government accounting, and to you, Dr. Nevermarks, because I think you both can answer, have some you can shed some light on this. There are different accounting standards for the public sector as opposed to the private sector. I'm interested in this difference, and I also have a very specific question. So, if you will, answer the specific question, get to the larger point, because my time is running short. But actually, I'm over time. But with the graciousness of my colleagues, the SEC has designated FASB as the accounting for publicly held companies. What about designating GASB as in terms of being able to capture? The SEC basically captures stale data at the broker-dealer level. What about capturing that data more upstream from the issuer? Would that be better? Would that give more transparency and more disclosure? And can you touch on that? So if you'll answer that, then get to the larger point, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Pension disclosure in the private or in the public sector, I think, is not as strong as it is in the private sector, where often in the public sector the actuarial reports come out, a year or more after the events that they're trying to date. In general, I mean, I've written about private sector pension accounting, and I've been critical of it in ways, but it much more closely approximates how you should measure the liabilities. A public or a private sector pension benefit is very secure, but it is not guaranteed. If the sponsor goes bankrupt, the retirees can lose some of their benefits. So those liabilities are discounted at a rate of return derived from corporate bonds. It means it's very safe, but it's not totally safe. With public sector pensions, the benefits are effectively guaranteed, often by state constitutions. That means they should be discounted at a lower interest rate. Instead, they're discounted at a higher discount rate. The GASB rules have things just precisely opposite of the way they should be. Dr. Novomarks?
I have nothing to add. I agree with him completely.
Okay. Finally, and then we'll go to my colleague, Ms. Maloney. Devin Nunes has introduced a piece of legislation in terms of transparency. It perhaps strikes at the heart of making sure you have accurate disclosures for public sector pensions. Dr. Biggs, can you touch on that? Are you favorable to this perspective? What are your thoughts on it?
I think the disclosure bill sponsored by Congressman Nunes would be very helpful, and it would require every state to disclose the market value of their pension liabilities, which means, A, you would get the numbers that would be much more accurate, but B, they would also be uniform between states. I testified several weeks ago alongside several individuals from the ratings agencies, and I got the impression they simply took the data from the public sector pensions as they published it. But I think it's important if you have a better measure of the liabilities and also a measure that is truly apples to apples from state to state. So I think that would be a very, very helpful step.
Anyone have anything to add there?
I think it would be a very helpful step as well. I think that there's actually a lot more information they could disclose. They actually forecast current expected cash flows every year into the future in calculating the liability, and there's no reason that they don't disclose that. It should be public information. They're public entities.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Maloney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank all of you for your testimony. I regret I had a conflict with another meeting, but I did read your testimony, and it contributes to the debate. So thank you. I'd like to begin with Dr. Biggs, and it really I'm going back to a lot of the debate that we had in the panel before you. Many people blame the poor financial condition of states on public pension systems, as if pension underfunding is the primary cause of a state's financial problems. In fact, the Republican staff on this committee issued 2 briefing memos that made this exact argument, if I could quote. The largest threat to state and municipal fiscal security is the government-sponsored pension plans. Yet in the prior panel, there were a series of editorials that I put together for this hearing from clear across the country, and they were saying that it wasn't a financial problem in those particular editorials. So my question, Dr. Biggs, is given what we heard from the governors and from the editorial boards, do you agree with this assertion that the largest threat to state municipal fiscal financial security is government-sponsored pension plans?
Well, as I stated in my testimony, the drivers and the cause of the deficits that state and local governments are suffering from now were distinct from public pension plans or distinct from public employee compensation. The question you're asking, though, is slightly different. It's saying, what is the largest threat to state and local finances? And that raises some different questions, because the pensions have shifted so heavily towards risky investments that even a small change in the rate of return they would receive would have significant impact on plan financing and on state budgets. For example, recently in California, the board of CalPERS, the public plan there, rejected their actuaries' recommendation. They shift from an assumed rate of return of 7.75% down to 7.5%. And the argument that people made was, we can't afford the extra payments that we required by assuming a reduction of 1/4 percentage point in our assumed rate of return. The problem is, if you're investing in the sorts of assets they are, which are heavy on equities, foreign investments, hedge funds, if you can't afford to lose 25 basis points in your rate of return, you're in very big trouble.
Well, actually, there's another hearing going on in financial services I need to get to, and in the regulatory reform bill, we tried to really bring some controls and safety to some of these investments. But I'd like to ask about an analysis by the National Association of State Retirement Administrators. And according to this analysis, less than 3% of all state and local government spending was used to fund public pension benefits. Do you agree with this, or do you dispute this data?
Oh, no, I agree that that figure is correct. The problem is, first, that a lot of states are not meeting, with the amount they're paying today, are not meeting the obligations they're supposed to pay under the more lax accounting rules from GASB, and B, if they use more honest accounting, they would have to pay significantly more than that. One example I looked at was Illinois, which was not even meeting its sort of actuarially required payments. If they had to pay the market value of their payments, it would be something like 14% of their state budget. That gets very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to cite another study from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And according to this study, the primary cause of pension shortfalls in our country was the economic collapse that we suffered in 2008, rather than inadequate contributions to government retirement programs.
Well, I think the argument made in that paper was that the shortfalls they're looking at now were a result of the downturn in the assets that they held. One reason they were holding so much risky assets was because it allows them to discount their liabilities at a high interest rate. So in effect, the poor state of funding we're seeing now is a function of the investment choices they made, and those investment choices they made were driven by the accounting.
We're trying to bring more accountability in those investment choices, but I'd like to ask Dr. Biggs, isn't it true that while pension plan underfunding is a problem for some states, there are more than a dozen states rated by the Pew Center as solid performers?
Let me put it to you this way. The Department of Labor has standards for the health of private sector pension plans. I believe a private sector pension plan that is under 80% funded is considered endangered, and a plan that's under 60% funded is considered critical. If public sector plans were required to use private sector accounting methods, I don't believe there would be a public sector plan in the country that would be more than 60% funded. They would all be considered critical. The accounting is very, very important here.
Well, to put it in, and I agree, you need accurate and uniform accounting systems. We just came out of a national recession, and it was certainly the greatest recession in my lifetime, and probably yours. And to me, it seems inaccurate and very unfair to tie the current financial problems that some states face with public retirement systems underfunding to a long-term pension crisis. Most economists, even from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Mr. Hall, Dr. Hall, states that this was the first recession that was caused by the financial markets. It caused this deep pain in this recession. And to say that because some states have some problems, that this is the cause of the problem. So
I don't believe I have said that public pensions are the cause of the problems. I'm not really aware of anybody else who has said that. What I would say is that the public pensions, because they were investing so aggressively, are particularly vulnerable to the financial downturn that we had. And second, that even if the recession was caused by other factors, we can't go back to Wall Street or we can't go back to the housing market and say, fix our problems. We have the problems that we have, and we have to make some decisions on how to fix our budgets going forward and how to fix these programs so that they're more robust in future years.
If I'm hearing you correctly, you said many of the problems came from investing so aggressively. So if the managers of the pension funds are the ones that are putting them in jeopardy, maybe we need stricter standards there and capital requirements and so forth.
It is not the managers. What happens in most states is the legislature will set the discount rate that they want to use for the pension. They'll say, we want to use an 8% discount rate. And they tend to choose a high discount rate because that makes the liabilities look small, that makes the annual payments small. Then the fund itself has to go out and say, well, how are we going to get 8%? You can't get 8% without taking a lot of risk. So now they're shifting more and more into alternative investments. An example I had from Wisconsin school districts were investing their pension funds in synthetic collateralized debt obligations. It's this chasing returns that is driven by the fact that a high return is imposed on them by legislatures who want to minimize the payments they want to make today.
Well, thank you. And if you have any final...
No, thank you very much. Really, thank you very much.
Thank you. And I appreciate the gentlelady's comments and questions. I appreciate the panel's testimony here today. This is certainly a critical issue, as we've heard from the governors and as we've heard from previous hearings on the municipal and state debt crisis that they're facing, budget crisis. Dr. Lockman, I've heard you speak before. Wanted to ask a final question, if I might. Does the euro survive?
It depends what you mean by that. If you mean are countries going to leave the euro, my strong conviction is they certainly are going to leave the euro. That if we look where the euro is going to be in 5 years' time, I'd be highly surprised if Ireland, Greece, Portugal, Spain, maybe Italy, whether they are part of the euro. But that doesn't mean that the euro disappears as a currency. That what you could get is you could get the euro, which is going to have as its members, the original strong countries of the North, the Germanys, the Frances, the Finlands, the Belgiums, and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Lockman. I appreciate you indulging me on that question. I do appreciate your testimony, and if you have further things for the record, we'd certainly welcome that. I know members will have 7 legislative days to submit questions or comments for the record. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for your hard work.
Thank you.